Hello, my name is Garchompro, and I've been challenging since set 2. In this video, I'll be discussing positioning for every new unit in set 9.5. I made a video at the beginning of set 9 going over the positioning for all the different units, so if it's a unit that's returning that isn't new in set 9.5 that you're looking on how to position, I highly recommend going and checking out that video. It'll be linked in the description. I'll be going through all the different units, starting with 1 cost, going on to 2 cost, then 3 cost, 4 cost, and finishing with the 5 cost units. Timestamps for every unit should be in the description. The first unit I'd like to cover is Graves. Now, Graves hits in an AoE around the target he has. So if, for instance, we have 3 units on the front line right here, if the Graves hits this right Cho'Gath, it'll hit the right and middle Cho'Gath. If he hits the left Cho'Gath, it'll hit left and middle. And if he hits the middle Cho'Gath, it'll hit all 3 Cho'Gaths. What this means is you generally want Graves to be in about the middle of the board, positioned in the middle of the enemy front line. That way you can hit as many units as possible. If I'm putting Graves on my front line with my other frontliners, let's say I'm using these Illaois as my front line, I like to be throwing Graves in the middle of my front line to have the highest likelihood of hitting multiple units. I generally don't like him on the outside of my front line. If you're like itemizing your Graves, you can consider putting him like second row, but I generally prefer to just use him as a supplemental frontliner, like so. The other thing is if you have Rogue active and you're like carrying your Graves, it's very viable to simply just solo frontline your Graves like so, or with your other Rogue units. This way, he'll take the damage first and immediately proc onto the enemy backline. So if you have Rogue active, you always want Graves to be on the same side as the enemy backline. So for instance, let's say they are carrying this Cassiopeia in the back right here. You want your Graves to be about right here. He's going to take the damage and immediately proc into the backline like so. Of course, even if you're not carrying the Graves, you can also just frontline everything like this, and he'll still be able to proc onto the Cassiopeia. So if you have the Rogue in, just make sure your Graves is the same side as enemy carry. Next up is Illaoi. Now, Illaoi's ultimate heals for a percent of the damage that the target she hits takes. What this means is that you want Illaoi to be hitting the same target as your carry. That way she can get the healing from the damage your carry is doing. So for instance, if I have a Jhin as my carry right here and these Cho'Gaths as my other frontliners, I'll typically position something like this with the Illaoi directly in front of the Jhin to guarantee that she's going to be hitting the same target as the Jhin. You can even do it like this to further guarantee it. That way she gets that extra healing. In addition, she likes to be on the outside of the front line anyways. Bastion units in general like to be on the outside of the front line. That way they can get the full use of their bonus armor and magic resistance. Because of course, if they're taking damage later into the fight, they're not going to be getting that extra bonus during the first 10 seconds, and generally speaking, your units in the middle are going to be taking damage after the units on the outside of your front line, so generally it's preferred to have your Illaoi on the outside, same size as your carry for those reasons. Next we have Millio. Now there's 2 ideas behind your Millio. You can either just have like a random Millio 1 or Millio 2 on your board with no items, just being some nice support and supplemental damage, or you can have like a 3-item Millio 3 that's going to be pumping out tons of damage with stuff like, Death Cap and Jewel Gauntlet. In the first scenario where we're running Millio as a supplemental unit, your main focus is going to be getting use out of the CC from his ultimate. What this generally means is that you want to have Millio on the same side as the primary enemy tank. Now, I've discussed this before, but the general principle is this. CC alone doesn't really do anything. Tank units generally don't care that much about CC. Of course, if you CC the enemy carry, they're, lacking damage during that time that they're CC'd, but an enemy tank doesn't necessarily care that much about the CC, except for the fact that while a unit is crowd controlled, they're unable to ult. What this means is that if you get a unit to max mana and then CC it while it's max mana before it ults, it's actually going to be taking damage during that period without gaining mana, essentially just wasting the damage it's taking. So you generally want to have Millio in front of the enemy primary tank to CC them and potentially mana lock like I just discussed, and it makes it a lot easier to kill certain units. Units like Shen and stuff, a lot of times the way you kill them is you CC them for a period of time so they can't get their ult and can't get their shields proccing, and then you're able to just kill them while they're just sitting there like a sitting duck. So generally just in front of the enemy main tank. The other principle is if you're trying to deal damage with Millio, you want him to be the same side as the enemy carry. His ball is going to bounce, and a lot of times it can bounce into the enemy backline. So if he's same side as the enemy carry, he's going to be more likely to hit them. And if you have like a Millio 3 with 3 items, you can just like 1 or 2 shot their carry. So in that scenario, I would just put him same side as enemy carry. I want to make a special note for Malzahar and Orianna because in my last video, I did discuss their positioning, but they've actually changed the way that Malzahar and Orianna work, which makes their positioning changed a bit. Orianna generally just wants to be on your back row. Typically, I'll have, like, let's say my carry in the corner. Let's say it's this Jhin right here. I like to have my Orianna next to the Jhin. You generally want her to be getting hit before your carry because she's usually not going to be your early game carry. So one of these hexes is good because these hexes will almost always get hit before the carry does. If you have, like, a lot of backliners, let's say I have, like, a lot of Jhins, I'll sometimes throw the Orianna into this row directly in front of them to guarantee she gets hit before them. But otherwise, you generally just have Orianna same side as your carry, and she just does a bit of extra damage and a bit of extra shielding for your front line. Malzahar, in my most recent positioning video, I talked about how Malzahar hits 3 units. Now he's capped at hitting 2 units, which means trying to min-max for getting 3 units in a line is pretty minimized. That being said, there is a big advantage to hitting 2 units as opposed to hitting 1 unit. So be very wary of if your opponent has their units spread out. If you want to counter Malzahar positioning in the early game, I recommend spreading out your front line like so. And a lot of times the Malzahar player will kind of just, not do anything, and they'll just only hit one of these Illaois. The way you deal with this as the Malzahar player is instead of putting your front line in a line, like this is standard positioning, right? Is you put your front line in a line like this, what's going to happen is these Illaois are going to be spread out from each other. What you can do, however, is move some of your front line back and try and get their front line to walk around one of your frontliners. Or you can offset your front line like this. What's going to happen here is these 2 Illaois will walk next to the Poppy, and there's a very good chance that these Illaois will line up like this, and you'll be able to hit 2 of these units with the Malzahar ult, because that Malzahar AI is a bit smarter than it used to be, so it's pretty much always going to be hitting these 2 Illaois right here. Whereas, of course, if I had my Poppies, over here, this Illaoi would just sit here, and I wouldn't be hitting any of my units. Generally speaking, though, you can just corner your Malzahar is typically what I do. It'll usually just end up being fine. Next unit I have is Naafiri. Now with Naafiri, what I typically like to do is just throw her on the outside of my front line like so, usually on this side right here. Now Naafiri is interesting because she does have the Darken, which whenever she dies, you'll be able to pass off the Darken. But with Naafiri's Darken, unlike Aatrox's Darken, the effect isn't that good, it's just some bonus damage. And Naafiri is actually a pretty good user of the Darken herself. She's Challenger, only has 50 mana, so she'll cast a lot and proc the Darken. So you don't necessarily care about passing it immediately like you sometimes would with an Aatrox. So I'll typically just have the Naafiri right here. That way she walks up, and then she can then just simply die, She'll get targeted second after this outermost Cho'Gath gets targeted, and then she dies, passes off her Darken. You're okay with her dying to pass it off. But you don't want her to be targeted immediately at the start of combat, because she'll be able to do a good amount of damage, especially if you're running like carry items on Naafiri. This is of course like the default positioning for a melee carry. You can also do this X right here, and that way she'll walk up like this, and be the second unit targeted, and being able to sometimes also go onto the enemy backline, because for instance, let's say I'm putting my melee carry right here, and my enemy frontline is positioned something like this for some reason, and they have a backliner right here. What'll typically happen is Naafiri will come up, kill this Illaoi, the Illaoi will be gone, your frontline will wrap around like this, and then Naafiri can just walk back onto your enemy's range carry. Of course, this applies to every melee carry, so whenever I talk about putting melee carries in one of these 2 hexes, that's the general principle, is that it keeps them safe and also potentially allows them to wrap onto the enemy carry. You can also consider putting Naafiri same side as your carry, that way you have a higher chance of the Darken buff passing to your carry, because they'll typically be the longest one alive, but it's pretty hard to get the Darken buff onto your carry. Just with the way the positioning is, it's kind of awkward. So generally, I just have Naafiri, just wherever I feel like her. That being said, if you have a melee carry like a Fiora or something, I would try and put the Naafiri next to the Fiora. That way you can pass on to her, and she can do a bit of extra damage with it. Next, I have Qiyana. Now, the thing with Qiyana is she's going to be hitting in a line. What this means is that you want to make sure that the Qiyana is going to like the left or right of the units she's hitting. So again, let's assume my opponent has these Cho'Gaths in the front line. The mistake would be have my Qiyana like walk up into one of these hexes right here, because she's not going to be able to get a nice line to hit a lot of these Cho'Gaths. What I want my Qiyana to do is walk to the outside, like either here or here. That way, when she hits in a line, she can hit multiple Cho'Gaths. So generally speaking, again, you just want to have your front line like this, and have your Qiyana walk to the outside of the enemy front line like so, or you can mirror it right here, put the Qiyana right here, and have her walk to the enemy outside of the front line like so. Again, if you have Rogue in, you want the Qiyana to be on the same side as the enemy carry. That way she can potentially walk onto them and CC them and do a bit of damage onto them. And again, if you're carrying your Qiyana, you have like a 2-star, 3-star Qiyana with items, you can consider just solo frontlining your rogue units, same side as enemy carry, to guarantee the proc as soon as possible, and potentially just kill them immediately into the fight, before that carry has a chance to do any damage to your team. The final 2-cost unit I have is going to be Twisted Fate. Now, Twisted Fate's ult is interesting. He does damage to a single target, and then after delay does some AoE damage. What this typically means is you want Twisted Fate to be more towards the middle. AoE ults are actually going to be generally worse in the corners. The corners are safer for carries, which is why you see people default to them. But, let's say my opponent has a front line like so with these Cho'Gaths right here. Well, if the Twisted Fate is right here and hits this outside Cho'Gath, it's only going to hit the outside Cho'Gath and this Cho'Gath right here with the AoE from his ultimate. So generally, it's better to have your Twisted Fate a little more towards the middle, like one of these hexes here. That way, no matter what he's hitting, he's going to be hitting one of these Cho'Gaths, and there's going to be units on either side of him, right? He'll hit either this Cho'Gath or this Cho'Gath, and he'll be able to do a bit more damage with that AoE from his ultimate, which is just going to be guaranteeing him a bit more damage. In addition, you can also consider putting Twisted Fate on the same side as the enemy carry. He might multicaster proc onto the enemy carry more reliably if he's the same side. Generally, there's not going to be a huge detriment to having Twisted Fate same side as enemy carry, but you might high roll if you have that multicaster active. so it is definitely something to keep in mind. Next, moving on to the 3 costs, we first have Misfortune. Now, similar to Twisted Fate, Misfortune is going to be doing AoE damage, meaning you generally want her to be like in the middle of your board in one of these 3 hexes here. That way she just has the highest chance of hitting multiple units, hitting the largest clump, and just doing a bunch of free damage. In addition, Misfortune actually destroys enemy shields partially, meaning you generally want Misfortune to be in front of the enemy units that are going to be shielding a lot. So if like a Shen and a Sejuani, you want to have the Misfortune in front of. So for instance, let's say my opponent's front line for some reason is like this Shen, Sejuani, and then let's just say like these 2 Nasus's right here. You generally want this Misfortune to be hitting this Shen Sejuani side as opposed to this double Nasus side. Obviously, this is a super simplified example because this isn't a real front line. But the principle is if your opponent has like a tank that's going to be shielding a lot, stuff like Taric, Shen, Sejuani, try and put the Misfortune more towards that side. Whichever side it may be, as opposed to the frontliners that won't be shielding that much, because then you won't be getting that shield shred from the Misfortune. Next, we have Nautilus. Now, Nautilus hits all units within a 2-hex radius, pulling them towards him and CCing them. What this means, of course, is if you have a Nautilus, you ideally want him to be in front of the enemy tank, due to the fact that it'll CC them, just like I talked earlier with the Millio, being able to CC enemy tanks. Their main tank is more valuable than hitting their supplementary tanks, because you can mana lock it a bit more effectively. You care more about mana locking the enemy main tank if they're like full mana, giving your carry a chance to kill them, as opposed to just, killing some random frontliner. Of course, if they have some sort of frontliner that a lot of times might only cast once and you're pretty scared of, such as like a Jarvan, it's also really valuable to try and CC that. So if they have a Jarvan, I really like to CC it. That way, if my Nautilus casts first, the Jarvan will be CC'd for I think a second and a half or something like that. And your carry has a really good chance to just kill that before the Jarvan even can cast, and that swings fights really heavily. Of course, if they also have a melee carry, you want the Nautilus in front of that melee carry to CC it as well. But outside of those general CC positioning principles, because Nautilus pulls units towards him, you want him to always be front of your AoE units. So let's say I'm running like a Misfortune and an Azir on my board. I want the Nautilus to be in front of my Misfortune, not my Azir, because she's going to be doing AoE damage. So it's going to be really valuable to pull them into that, as opposed to the Azir who's doing single target damage and doesn't care. So just always have the Nautilus in front of your AoE unit. Silco's another really common example to run with Nautilus. That way you can just guarantee that you get as much AoE effective value as possible. The next unit we have is Neeko. Now, as I discussed earlier with Bastion units, we generally want to have them on the outside of the front line. That way they can utilize their armor and MR buff as, quickly as possible. That way it doesn't wear off during the first 10 seconds. That being said, I actually do prefer to have Neeko in the middle of my front line. So a lot of times I'll position something like so. And the reason for this is she hits in a 2-hex radius and actually does a pretty considerable amount of damage, even with like no items, just at 2-star. Because she hits in a 2-hex radius, she's going to be hitting all 4 of these Cho'Gaths right here if you have the Neeko right here. Whereas if I had the Neeko right here, she wouldn't be hitting the leftmost Cho'Gath. So I generally just like to have the Neeko in the middle. You can also consider solo frontlining your Neeko. Especially if you have like a Stoneplate on her. Solo frontline Stoneplate Neeko is pretty decent due to the fact that all the enemy units on the frontline will clump around the Neeko and she'll be able to hit them and do a bunch of damage with her ultimate. This is especially good if you have like the electric Ishtal, because then she'll be able to CC all of these units. That being said, Neeko is a little bit squishy. She does have like a shield on her ultimate, but a good amount of her power dynamic is in the damage she deals. So for a 3-cost tank, she's a little squishier than normal. So I don't usually like solo frontlining my Neeko. This is also part of the reason why I don't actually like Neeko on my outside of my front line usually anyways, because she's a little squishier than a lot of the other like Bastion units. So she just dies like quickly into the fight. If I'm running like 4 Bastion, I'll typically have like the Shen and Kassadin take the damage first, just because they're a bit tankier of units. That being said, if I'm running like Cassante plus Taric plus Shen plus Neeko, so something like this, I'll typically just have the Neeko on the outside of the front line alongside the Shen, because you don't want the Cassante to be getting hit first, and the Taric, of course, needs to be in the middle, so that way he gets value off of his ultimate. So I'll usually just position something like this if I'm running the 4 Bastion. Obviously, it's not necessarily ideal to have the Neeko on the outside here, but I care more about the other units, so I just end up positioning like so. The final 3-cost is going to be Quinn. Now, positioning the Quinn yourself isn't that big of a deal. The main thing to worry about is going to be her ultimate. Now, her ultimate is going to be hitting the column or row that has the most amount of units. What this means is that if you're playing versus Quinn particularly, you need to make sure that your largest column or row is not going to be your carry. Because especially if there's like a Quinn 3 with like a Radiant Deathblade, she can just straight up one-shot your carry. So for instance, let's say I'm playing versus a Quinn, and this is my backline, and this is my frontline. Right, these Cho'Gaths are my frontline, these Jins are my backline. It would be really foolish to position something like this, because the largest column is going to be these 2 Cho'Gaths plus these 2 Jins, and the Quinn's going to hit through them. Now, you usually don't position like this anyways, but this would be something to avoid. The bigger thing to avoid would be overclumping your backline. For instance, let's say I have 5 Jins right here. The largest row is going to be these 5 Jins. The Quinn's going to be able to guarantee a 5-unit ultimate every time, and my backline carry is going to be one of these, so it's going to be taking the damage. The Quinn just might come in and one-shot all of my backline. If you have too many backline units versus a Quinn that's stacked, what you can consider doing is offsetting your frontline and backline a little. For instance, let's say I'm running 4 backliners and 4 frontliners. To guarantee that my backline isn't the one being hit, I can simply just throw a backline unit up a row like this. Now, generally speaking, my 4 frontline units will be in the row. I can even, further guarantee it if I don't necessarily care about this Jin right here. I can do something like this. That way, it's really unlikely that it's going to be hitting my back row, because even if one of these Cho'Gaths walks up, these 3 units are still in my front row, and it's going to be hitting this front row like so. So generally speaking, I like to offset my backline in case I'm worried about a Quinn if I have too many backline units. Of course, comps that don't have a lot of backline units, just make sure that you don't accidentally put your carry in like a single file column. But generally speaking, just the more you spread out versus Quinn, the better, because then she's going to only be hitting 1 or 2 units with an ultimate and losing a lot of her potential value. Next, moving on to the forecast, we first have Fiora. Now, there's kind of 2 different ways you can position around your Fiora. The first is if you're sitting here with a Fiora that has something like a Sterak's, Night Harvester, or Titans where you want to be taking damage, and you have like a Bloodthirster allowing you to heal, you want to be frontlining your Fiora. The standard way would be to have your frontline units like so, with the Fiora in one of these 2 hexes. That way she's not directly in the middle of the board, and you can kind of control which side she's going onto, because you generally want Fiora to be same side as enemy carry, but that way she can also take some damage immediately at the start of the fight. The other frame of mind for Fiora is if she's, not as tanky or doesn't care about like taking the damage immediately. She doesn't have stuff like Sterak's. She doesn't maybe have healing, so you don't really want her to be taking damage immediately. Or she's like 1-star and you're kind of worried about her being a bit squishy. You can throw Fiora onto the second row like this. That way she'll walk up and be a bit safer. This Cho'Gath will always be getting targeted before the Fiora, which keeps her a bit safer. Again, I typically like the Fiora on the same side as the enemy carry. I feel with the way she works, she just has a really high likelihood to just wrap onto the enemy carry. It's just really common that if the enemy has like their Cho'Gath's position like this, and they have a Cassiopeia here as the carry, the Fiora will ult onto the Cho'Gath right here, and then just like land on this side and dash into the Fiora and kill the enemy carry. So same side as enemy carry is always going to be preferred with Fiora generally. I do think one other advantage of putting the Fiora in one of these spots though, is she is more likely to wrap onto the enemy carry than if you put her in the front line like this. So if you really are banking on getting onto that enemy carry, do recommend having the Fiora in one of these hexes. That being said, a lot of times I am giving Demacia to my Fiora, so I'll position my front line something like this with the Fiora in this hex right here, or just this hex. The main reason for this hex directly to the left of this one to the right is just that way I can give the 5 armor and magic resist to this extra Cho'Gath here. Typically, if you're just running 3 Demacia with your Fiora, you generally aren't going to be worried that much about giving the magic resist and armor because it's only 5, but just giving it to 1 extra unit is a little nice. And this hex here is effectively the same as this hex anyways, because the Fiora is just immediately going to walk into this hex right here, so there's really no change. The next unit we have is going to be Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser will pretty much typically always be positioned in one of these 2 hexes right here. Even with or without rapid fire cannon, I generally just like him in one of these 2 hexes. That way he can just walk onto the outside of your front line. Again, he won't be the first unit targeted, and he should be a bit safer this way. Typically, Mordekaiser does want to be run with rapid fire cannon, so if you're positioning like this and the enemy has their front line like so, your Mordekaiser will start hitting this Illaoi on the outside with the rapid fire cannon. He's not going to be walking up to the first row, and you can keep him nice and safe like this. And then he has a good chance, like once he gains his range, to actually accidentally wrap onto the enemy backline on the same side. So Mordekaiser same side as enemy carry is definitely a viable strategy. That being said, another frame of mind is have your Mordekaiser opposite side of the enemy carry because he stacks up during the fight. That way, once he gets to the enemy carry later on in the fight, he's going to have a higher chance of killing them in the 1v1 because he gains stats every time he kills a unit. So if you see your enemy carry is squishy, you may want the Mordekaiser to be same side as enemy carry. You think you can kill them at the start of the fight. That being said, if the enemy carry isn't squishy, you want them to be opposite side of him. So you want Mordekaiser to be opposite side of them generally. The biggest thing to keep in mind though with Mordekaiser is you do want him to be on the weak side of the enemy front line. If your enemy front line has some weaker units, generally want to be putting the Mordekaiser in front of them to guarantee he gets the kills onto those units and gets those sweet stats from his kills whenever he gets a kill. Next we have Nilah. Now Nilah's ultimate is interesting because it does AoE that's based off of her effective attack range. This is part of why rapid fire cannon is so good on her, by the way, because in addition to making her safer, it also makes it easier for her to hit multiple units. Now, what you would think is that you want to min-max your Nilah to hit as many units as possible with her ultimate, but the way, or not her ultimate, but the AoE part of her attacks, but the way it actually works is it's capped at doing damage to 2 extra units, meaning it's really not worth min-maxing because you usually can get those 2 extra units anyways. Typically, though, I'll just have my Nilah in one of these 4 hexes, either this, or this. I think these ones slightly more in the middle is a bit more reliable towards hitting more units. Just the way the angle works out ends up hitting more units a lot of the time. But realistically, it doesn't matter that much. Generally, Nilah, same side as your carry, is going to be good. That way they stack damage, especially if you're running a Xayah. And then also same side as enemy carry is good. That way she has potential to wrap onto them. Of course, I do this positioning if I have a rapid fire cannon. If you don't have a rapid fire cannon, I highly recommend getting your Nilah to be directly onto the outside of the enemy front line. So position your frontliners in these hexes right here, and then have either the Nilah here or here. That way she walks onto the outside like this, and she can hit in a line onto the enemy front line like so. So if she walks into, this hex right here, she can hit these 2 Cho'Gaths. And if she walks into this hex right here, she can hit these 2 Cho'Gaths, or she can even hit it from angles like this and hit the Cho'Gaths right here. That way she's just hitting as many units as possible. This, similar to what I was talking about with the Qiyana, where you're trying to just hit multiple units in a line. Of course, hers is a bit more of a cone than a line, so you have a bit more leeway with it. Like if she's hitting right here, she should be hitting both the Cho'Gaths, but I generally think hitting it sideways into the front line is a bit better. That being said, if you have a rapid fire cannon, you actually don't want her to be hitting sideways. You want her to be hitting generally more straight on. The reasoning for this is it has a higher chance of hitting the enemy carry. If you have your Nilah positioned like this with rapid fire cannon, it's really likely that she'll hit the Cassiopeia with like the AoE from her attack and potentially just kill the enemy carry. Whereas if you had your Nilah angled like this, it's not going to be hitting that. So generally you want to be angling head on with rapid fire cannon and angling slightly to the side without rapid fire cannon. Because if you don't have rapid fire cannon, of course, your range is going to be lower. So you do need to be guaranteeing that you're hitting as many frontliners as possible because you don't even have a chance of hitting the backline anyways. Next, we have Silco. Silco will generally just be in the middle of your backline. He does AoE, so you want to be making sure that you get as much potential value with the AoE as possible. Similar principle to how I talked about with like Misfortune and Twisted Fate. One other thing with Silco is you generally want to be having your front line clumped up. Generally, if you're running a AoE unit, there's a couple different principles you can have. The first is to solo frontline a unit. That way they all clump around your solo frontline unit. Let's say they have these Illauis here. The Illauis will all rock around this Cho'Gath and clump around it, and you'll be able to do a bunch of AoE damage. This is something I talked about with stuff like Misfortune. Allows you to just hit that AoE on the front line. That being said, Silco actually generally doesn't want this positioning because another part of his ultimate is the healing from it. So you actually want to be clumping your front line like so. That way it's going to be healing your frontliners and dealing damage to them. So Silco just really wants everything to be clumped together. One thing to note is if you have Virulent on your Silco, I usually just move him 1 hex to the right or left, depending on which side my carry is. That way he's going to be same side as my carry, just guaranteeing that he's going to be applying Virulent to the same target my carry's hitting, giving them that extra 15% bonus damage, which is pretty significant. Finally, we have Xayah. Xayah positioning is mostly going to be due to the fact that whenever she hits a unit with her ultimate, she's going to be shredding the armor. So you want Xayah to be on the same side as your other AD damage dealer. Generally is going to be Nilah. I like to have Xayah and Nilah on the same side. That way she can armor shred for your Nilah, and your Nilah can potentially get those kills. And finally, we have Gangplank. Now, typically right now, people will generally be putting Gangplank on the back row as opposed to the front row. Currently, it's just considered better to get that extra mana than whatever the front row gives you. So you generally are just throwing your Gangplank wherever on the back row. In terms of positioning for his ultimate, I don't think his ultimate is based off of his positioning at all. I haven't seen anything about how it's based off his positioning. If it is, please let me know, and there may be a more optimized way to position the Gangplank. But as of right now, I don't know a way to position the Gangplank super optimally in the backline. Wherever is generally just fine. The one thing you need to keep in mind is that his ult does hit in an AoE. So again, the general principles that I was talking about with stuff like the Neeko and the Silco, trying to get that enemy front line to clump around yours is helpful because you can potentially hit more units. In addition, clumping your units together is actually pretty powerful too, because it's going to be giving them attack speed and crowd control immunity. So generally, I just like to have my front line all clumped together whenever I'm running Gangplank, and usually there's not like a ton of thought going into it or positioning intricacies because he hits a pretty big AoE anyways. So yeah, I typically just clump my front line together. The one thing to keep in note is if you do end up frontlining your Gangplank, which I did say was uncommon, generally you do want the Gangplank to be in front of whatever the enemy tank is with multiple items. So the thing to keep in mind is that, let's say this enemy, Shen has stuff like Bramble and Dragon's Claw that's going to be reducing the damage. Gangplank's actually is going to be doing true damage to enemy units with like his Ignite whenever he autos in his melee form. What this means is that you do want him to be hitting those units that have those extra resistances, because true damage is more powerful against unit that has extra resistances as opposed to ones that don't, right? So if, hitting those like Bastion units or the Dragon's Claw, Bramble Vest, Stoneplate units is going to be more effective than hitting something like a Warmog's unit or a unit without items, because the true damage is going to go a farther way. Finally, I'd like to discuss Ryze positioning. I don't think I covered it fully in my previous video, and in addition, there are a couple extra Ryzes, so I just want to briefly cover each of the different Ryzes and how to position them. First, we have Bandle City. Bandle City, don't really worry about it too much, just throw him on your backline. Where he is doesn't really matter that much. If you, are summoning a unit and you want that unit to be on a certain side, put your Ryze on that side. That way that unit can summon on that side and do what it does, but that'll be based off the units you're summoning anyways. Next, we have Bilgewater. I wouldn't really worry too much about the Bilgewater. He does do AoE to the largest cluster of enemies, so I guess if you have like a lot of gold, it's definitely good to have the enemy team's frontline clump around yours. So maybe you solo frontline a unit like I talked about to try and get the highest amount of units you can hit with this Bilgewater ult, or just in general, just clump your frontline a little more together to try and maximize the amount of units you hit, because of course more clumped units is going to be more units hit, as opposed to if you have your frontline spread out. Next, we have Demacia. If you have Demacia, you want to make sure that you have your frontline clumped together. That way you can hit a bunch of them and shield them. Next, we have Freljord. Freljord, again, if you want to hit the frontline, have your frontline clumped together. That being said, a lot of times you actually want to hit the backline, which would mean that sometimes you want to actually spread out your frontline. That way he has a higher chance of hitting onto the enemy backline, because if you end up creating a clump of like 4 units in the frontline, he's always going to be ulting them with the Freljord and not applying the chill effect to the backline. Whereas if you have the enemy's frontline spread out, like there's 2 units here, 2 units there, and then there's like 2 units in the backline, he has a chance to hit those 2 units in the backline and CC their enemy carry. So do keep that in mind. Next, we have Ionia. I don't think Ionia positioning matters too much because he's hitting a certain amount of units. That being said, if there is a unit that you want to be guaranteeing the attack speed buff onto, and the healing, definitely recommend putting them in the middle of the board. So definitely put your primary tank in the middle of the board, and if you have a carry, potentially in the middle of the board as well. Outside of like your important units with items though, he's going to be hitting the same amount of units every time, so it's generally not going to matter too much. But yeah, put your most important units in the middle, and then enemy players, of course, don't put your most important units in the middle. That way they're not going to be hitting by the Ionia tree. A lot of times you'll still just get hit anyways, especially if it's like a Ryze 2. 7 units is a lot, but spreading them out away from the middle is going to be safer, which means, of course, you do want to be putting your more filler units that you don't care as much about in the middle if you're playing versus an Ionia Ryze. That way they can kind of eat some of that effect of the Ionia. Next, we have Ixtal. Ixtal, you typically just want to put your Ryze in the middle center. That way he hits in AoE. He's a 2-ranged unit, weirdly, so having him on the back row doesn't do anything. So yeah, just second row directly behind your backline, and just in the middle, so that way he hits the most units and does stunning to them, and the crowd control, and also does a good amount of damage. Next, we have Noxus. Noxus positioning doesn't really matter. He just throws axes to random units, so where you put him does not matter at all. Next, we have Piltover. Again, Piltover is going to be hitting the largest clump of enemies, so where the Ryze is doesn't matter. Where your frontline is kind of matters. You can try and force the enemy frontline to clump around like their melee carry. That's the biggest one. Piltover is really good into a melee carry because it'll trap them. So if you can try and get the melee carry to be dragged into the enemy clump, it's going to be effective. So just, generally just clumping your frontline is going to be your best bet here. If you spread out your frontline like this, it's really possible that your enemy has like a bunch of units clumped in the frontline like so. And then let's say they have like a melee carry, like let's say it's this Rek'Sai right here. If the Rek'Sai is sitting over here, you might not hit it with the Piltover. But if you have your frontline clumped like this, it's really likely that it walks in and gets hit by the Piltover anyways. Next, we have Shadow Owls. Shadow Owl positioning doesn't matter at all. He's just marking units whenever he ultimates, so don't worry about Shadow Owl's positioning. Next, we have Shurima. Again, Shurima positioning doesn't really matter. He kind of just hits pretty much everything on the enemy board, and yeah. It does hit in a line, so what the enemy can consider doing is trying to spread out their units, that way they're not in a line. Like, for instance, if you have units in like a line like so, they're all going to be hit by the tornado. So having stuff in opposite corners like this is going to guarantee that you're going to get hitting the least amount of units hit. That way it's probably only going to be hitting 2 of these outside Illaois like this. So you can try and not position your units in a line versus it. But if you're the Ryze player yourself, there's not really that much you can do positioning wise. Next we have Targon. He's going to be picking up a unit and throwing it. So if they have a melee carry, you want to put him immediately in front of that melee carry to, of course, pick it up and throw it so you see it. And then, of course, if they have a primary tank, you want to pick it up, because if you can pick up that primary tank, it's going to be off the battlefield for a couple seconds, which is going to prevent it from shielding the enemy team, and your units can kill through it. And sometimes they'll kill like the enemy front line while that main tank is lifted up, and then you'll kind of have your entire team fall onto the enemy backline and start killing them. This can definitely happen. Like, let's say, you know, my enemy's main tank is this Illaoi, and then I have my Ryze right here with, like, let's say my carry is this Aphelios right here. What might happen if I pick up this Illaoi is it'll get picked up, it'll be off the field for a few seconds. My Aphelios, you know, kill this Cho'Gath, maybe kills this Cho'Gath because they're a bit weaker, they don't have the tank items, and then he can kind of walk onto the enemy backline and kill their carry. And if you can kill the carry quickly into the fight, you usually just win. Even if this Illaoi comes back, once her team is dead, you know, it's not good. Generally speaking, you want your primary tank to be the one taking the damage first anyways. That way it keeps the rest of your team alive longer. So just being able to pick up that enemy tank and prevent it from actually tanking is going to be really powerful. And then in terms of Zon positioning, you just want him to be same side as your carry. That way you can get that Shred and Sunder effect. He hits a lot of units anyways, though, so you don't have to worry too much about it. But I would just have the Zon Ryze a closer, like on the same-ish side as my carry, to try and guarantee that I get that effect. If you made it to the end, I want to thank you so much for watching, and I hope this video was very helpful for you, and you'll be able to utilize these positioning tips in order to win games that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe. I'll definitely keep making more content throughout set 9.5 and make another one of these videos in set 10. And so yeah, thank you for watching.